Join me on the water table as I speak with Ruth McCabe from the Heartland Co-op. Ruth is a conservation agronomist, and we're talking all things batch and build, saturated buffers, biosystem reactors, and much, much more. So welcome to the Water Table Podcast. Today I have Ruth McCabe with me. Ruth has been on the Water Table previously. She's a great guest, and for those that maybe missed that episode, I'm going to read Ruth's bio here a minute, but Ruth leads a conservation team at Heartland Co-op in Iowa. She is a passionate advocate for sustainable farming practices in the Midwest and has devoted her career to working with farmers who want to adopt conservation into their management plans. Ruth is a certified professional agronomist, an Iowa CCA. You could probably explain that to me in a little bit, and has her MS in crop production from Iowa State University. Prior to her current role, Ruth worked as a technical agronomist, an organic agronomist, and a research agronomist around the Midwest for over a decade. Her favorite topic is pheasant hunting. We're going to talk about that a little bit because I am interested. And she specializes in cover crops, prairie management, and edge of field structures. So we're going to talk about that, of course, as part of the Water Table. That's been something we've talked about often on the Water Table. So welcome to the podcast. Welcome in studio here. Thanks for driving all the way to Minnesota.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me. And I was really excited to see the studio because my inner geek was like, man, there's going to be those funny spongy panels on the walls. There's going to be a dead cat microphone. A little disappointed that there's not a dead cat microphone, but I won't hold it against you. So it's cool. This is a super, super neat space.
If it was a little warmer out, we'd just do this outside.
And then
you
I could have the dead cat.
Yeah, that's right.
Well,
right.
Invite me back in like August.
And we will, because at the Water Table, we like great guests, and you are one of them. So
I don't know. Wait till the end of this.
Well,
yeah, you don't know. Maybe you won't think I'm great at the end of this.
Well, you won't find out till months
true.
from now whether if we don't invite you back, then you weren't.
We lost the recording. Sorry.
But thanks for being here, and let's just start by talking a little bit about what you do in your role at Heartland Co-op, and is I guess first explain that, and then an add-on question is there a lot of people that have your type of position at other co-ops around the country? Because it's probably not unique, but unique to the last few decades.
Absolutely, yeah. So, my title is officially conservation manager, but I'm a conservation agronomist, and I lead a team of conservation agronomists at Heartland Cooperative, and we are hiring right now. So please go to our website and see the application. But our goal, 20-second elevator speech, is to help farmers adopt conservation farming practices that reduce the loss of sediment or nutrients from their farm fields. So that's like, in a nutshell, what we do. And then our team builds public and private partnerships with municipalities, with treatment utilities, with IDALs, the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, with local NRCS offices, local SWCDs, watershed management authorities, and then private industry. So like our industry partners, BASF, Helena, Bayer, Corteva, Syngenta, you name it, right? And we try to build these partnerships for supporting a conservation program, whatever that looks like. So we are partnered on a program called the Wetland Wave, where we bring high-efficiency treatment wetlands, you might call them micro-wetlands, to an area where they can treat a large upland drainage area by taking a minimum number of acres out of agricultural production. We're partnered on a saturated buffer and bioreactor batch and build. My team actually leads several batch and builds now around Iowa. We're partnered on a cover crop cost share program where we run a high-clearance cover crop seeding machine. So, these partnerships are us going out selling these conservation practices to farmers or landowners, and then leveraging existing cost share programming, all taxpayer dollars that are already allocated towards those cost share programs, leveraging those programs, and using private industry support to support my team, and putting those two together, and then going out and selling these cost share programs in a more efficient, effective manner than has traditionally been the case, right? So we're really good at it, and we're really passionate about it.
Sure. Great. So you named a bunch of different programs and practices, and what do you see as maybe a couple of different questions? What has gained the most momentum over the last couple of years from those, and what is the most practical? Maybe they're the same thing, maybe they aren't.
That's a great question. And so you asked earlier, and I just want to touch on it before we go further. You said, hey, well, are there a lot of conservation agronomists? And I would just say there's not a ton, but they are growing. It is a oh man, best pun ever, growing field. It's a growing field. So if anybody who's an agronomist is listening to this and wondering, could I also get into conservation agriculture? You can. My Heartland Cooperative has the largest conservation team, but other co-ops in Iowa are also launching their own conservation teams. So it's not hard to find. Just Google conservation agronomist, and there's more positions popping up. All right, to answer your question, what conservation program that my team is a part of has grown the most over the last few years? By far, the batch and build. Saturated buffers and bioreactors have been wildly popular among landowners and tenant farmers, and there are reasons for that, and we can discuss that. Our high clearance cover crop interseeder program was like the flagship public-private partnership at Heartland. I wrote the grant proposal for that alongside Polk County and the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship. Oh man, that thing took a year and a half to get off the ground. Lots of behind the scenes blood, sweat, and tears. It has been very successful, but by far. And then the wetland program it's really exciting, but that's really tough because you're going to landowners and you're saying, hey, I want to put this treatment wetland that's gonna drain 1,000 upland acres into your property, and there's pumps and there's just dredging, just things that need to happen. That is very intimidating to a landowner. Whereas the saturated buffer and bioreactor program, man, that's like easy peasy. You already have a buffer in place. Let's just put some perf pipe in there and get a water control structure in there and start treating some of the water coming out of your tile drainage. We don't even have to take land out of production. That's an easy sell. Bioreactors are like, a 1/16 of an acre. I mean, they're eensy beensy. If you already have a large, riparian area or buffer in place, then you just put it in that spot. You're not taking any land out of production. Those have been so easy to sell to landowners. And I say sell, we're not getting paid by landowners or farmers. We're just leveraging the cost share programming and then falling back on private industry sponsorship for our activities.
Sure.
So
yeah, it does. And like you say, there, the reasons for that, when I would have thought that the cover crops probably would be even more popular, even though they are. And is there reasons for why that isn't?
So many reasons. Yeah. I wrote a whole manuscript. Actually, I sent you the manuscript at like 9:00 last night. I'm sure you did not have time to read it, but I thought maybe this will help him understand.
Obviously, I didn't.
It's okay.
Because I'm asking the question,
no, it's
but
fantastic.
I did see it.
No, what you could have said, no, I did read it. That's why I'm asking you the question, Ruth. So you could have just played. Jamie, come on. All right.
Should we edit that?
So there's lots of reasons why cover crops are not as popular as you'd think that they would be. A lot of it comes down to, expense and lost yield. So like a lot of farmers anecdotally, now I'm going to take a step back. I've been working with cover crops for over a decade, probably 15 years now. Used to work in cover crop research at the University of Minnesota. So I've got I used to sell cover crop seed as a seed salesman. So I got a lot of experience with cover crops. And I will tell you that in Iowa with our heavy wet soils, anecdotally, a lot of farmers see yield hits from using cover crops, especially using something like cereal rye, which is by far the most popular cover crop and the cheapest. And so...
Why is that? Explain that.
Yeah, so rye is a beast, and it's my favorite cover crop, even though it's like the most boring. It can grow through a nuclear holocaust, which, God willing, we won't actually ever experience. But and it grows in harsh winter conditions. It'll still come back in the spring. I mean, you can throw it out broadcast, it'll still grow. It's an amazing crop, but it's also very aggressive and can be a competitor for nutrients with something like corn. Soybeans play really well, actually, with rye. I don't have a problem with soybeans and rye, but I have several conservation customers, tenant farmers who are conservation users, and they use cover crops, and they will tell you, yeah, I do see yield hits, even in my beans. There is anecdotally, rye has something called allelopathy. There's a lot of research that shows that allelopathy doesn't impact something like soybeans or corn, but there's research coming out now. There was a study that just came out a few months ago that talks about how using satellite imagery, they were able to kind of prove that even in soybean fields, you were across the board seeing a slight decrease in yield when farmers were using cover crops ahead of their beans or cover crops ahead of their corn. Now, corn is much easier to understand. Rye is a grass. It's competitive. It's going to tie up nutrients as it decomposes. Super easy to understand why it would inhibit corn. And I've traveled around the world and across the United States over the last few years understanding how cover crops work in farm management operations. And unless you're using starter, like when you're planting your corn, you're probably going to see a yield hit to corn if you're using rye, right? Just because it's so competitive and it's another grass. But ahead of beans really surprised me to read this recent research that says that farmers are still seeing yield decreases. They're slight. We're talking 3-4 bushel.
That's what I was going to ask. On corn.
Yeah, corn or beans. Yeah, corn or beans. Beans, I think, is lower. I think it was like 2 to 3, maybe. But that surprised me. But I guess when I talk with my farmers, I've had so many farmers say, yeah, but I still see a very slight decrease ahead of my beans. And I think anecdotally that supports their experiences, even though there are so many cover crop advocates who are like, no, you're just not managing them correctly. You're just, you just didn't terminate it on time, or you did this wrong, or you did that wrong. And I'm kind of like, Iowa has really heavy, wet soils. I actually think it's realistic that this could be a problem. And so to come back to your question, our cover crop program, where we're using an interseeder, we try to reduce costs across the board so that farmers are paying the lowest price possible. They do qualify for cost share. But cover crop cost share in Iowa is not robust. State cost share is $15 an acre, and it's up to 160 acres. Most farmers are going to put in exactly 160 acres. They might be able to stack that with a locally known cover crop cost share program from an organization called PFI, or Practical Farmers of Iowa. That's another $10. That's $25. But seed will cost you probably 18 to $20 an acre. That's just if you're doing rye. If you're doing multi-species mixes, that goes up. Then you've got termination costs in the spring. On average, farmers are paying $35 to $45 to plant a cover crop. So if you're paying $35 to $40 to plant a cover crop, you're probably going to take a small yield hit, and you're only getting a max of $25 cost share. Yeah. It's just not popular. Yeah. But saturated buffers and bioreactors, they're paid for 100%, plus you get an outlet incentive right now with cost share. So a landowner doesn't have to take land out of production, and they can put something in that has a high efficiency for treating tile water and removing nitrates. They don't have to pay for it. It gets handled by a batch and build coordinator, which means that they're not even receiving tax. They don't have tax implications on the money that goes into the cost share component, and they get $1,000 or $500 or whatever the incentive is per the program per outlet that they treat. So I mean, that's a no-brainer. So it's just been wildly more popular. And I think too, there's a lot of people who don't want to experience those yield hits. Right. So they don't want to mess around with cover crops. Right. For them, something like an edge of field structure is a way better option. So it surprised me that it was so popular, but we're running with it.
Yeah. And, I have a more specific question around cover crops, and we'll get to the bioreactors and batch and build. But just specifically to Minnesota, just given you're talking about some of the challenges in Iowa with wetter soils, but in Minnesota, I think some of the challenges are more just the length of the seasons, right? And
absolutely.
You have experience here. What do you see in that as far as crops that work, and how late can they actually get these cover crops in, if it's a later fall of harvest? Yeah,
that's a great question. Yeah, so Minnesota is absolutely more limited. Your soils are lighter than ours, and so they're sandier, lighter, depending on where you are. And so driving up here, it's always kind of an eye-opener for me because the soil types up here are just so wildly different from central Iowa. That shouldn't be surprising, but it always is. And it's the first thing I look at. But y'all are just so limited by growing season. I would say your growing season's anywhere from 3 to 4 weeks shorter than ours, and depending on the year, could be even shorter, right? So rye is still a good bet. Rye is going to work. That stuff, you can plant it so late. Probably up here, you can get away with planting it in November, even December, depending on how mild the winter is. And it'll probably still grow. It won't necessarily qualify for your cost share limitations, right? Because I don't know what Minnesota's cost share seeding dates are, but in Iowa, the seeding dates are like mid-October or something. Sometimes they extend it into November for rye as an overwintering species. So rye is always a fantastic bet. It wouldn't be something I would use ahead of corn, but an overwintering species I might use ahead of corn, and I'm really becoming a big fan of this species, I've been doing a lot of experiments the last few years with farmers in Iowa, is winter camelina. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's a brassica. I'm really excited about it. It overwinters. It is a brassica. From my experience, you can't plant it too early. You shouldn't plant it too early because it'll bolt. So you really do need to wait until October to get this stuff down. You don't need very many seed per acre. You need 4 pounds per acre because it's a brassica, so it's got really tiny seeds. And it grows. Now, it's not as impressive as rye, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend rye ahead of corn unless you've got starter and you've got ways to get around that nutrient tie-up. But camelina is a good overwintering option that will grow and produce some foliage on top of the ground, and it produces a really decent root mass underground, and it terminates really nicely too. It doesn't tie up nutrients. It's very low. Its carbon to nitrogen ratio and its biomass above ground is very low, so it decomposes really quickly. So that's something I'm getting more excited about ahead of corn. Oats are always a classic ahead of corn, but you gotta drill them, or you gotta vertical till them in, or you gotta get them some good seed to soil contact because they don't like drying out the way rye can handle drying out a little bit. So, an oat takes in water, and then it can't stop taking in water. It's got to send down roots and germinate. If it dries out, it's just going to die. So those are like the 3 that I'm really excited about. People talk about multi-species mixes. I'm less of a fan of those. I think that you need to really know what you're doing with a multi-species mix, and also they are atrociously expensive. And I'm not sure that it's worth it, especially the further north you go. I'm not sure that a multi-species mix, with 30 different species in it or whatever we're seeing nowadays, is worth the $122 price tag. Some people really get into it, and I'm happy for them. But
good answer to the question that I was really going to ask. No, it's a good answer because this is where I was going to. And I hope the answer is yes, because it'll get into. But have you ever seen the documentary "Kiss the Ground"?
Oh God, oh man! I was trying not to swear, and here you are throwing me a bone.
This is perfect because I've had a lot of questions. So here now you can solve my questions.
Here's the thing: I'm torn because I like Woody Harrelson.
So actually, I have tried, just in full disclosure, I've tried to get some of those people on the water table, and they have not responded. So,
you don't say. You don't say they haven't responded. I wonder why.
So let's talk about that a little bit, because part of that was the multi-species mix, right? And to me, just not knowing anything, that made sense.
Yeah, it's a real sexy story. Just like on YouTube, you see farmers who plant green into rye with their corn or whatever, and it looks real hot. You watch it, and it's like, damn, that's really cool. What you don't know is that farmer is dumping tons of starter on, then they're going in side dressing. I mean, they don't talk about any of that, right? And it's the same thing with multi-species mixes. The concept's great, but it costs a ton of money, and I used to work as a seed salesperson for a small seed company. We love selling those mixes because they're really expensive, and it's hard to get them seeded. You need to have equipment that can seed them properly, a drill with a small seed box and a large seed box, and if you're just broadcasting it, you're really flushing your money down the toilet. They don't tend to grow well, depending on if they bolt or create more of their own seed, like brassicas, a camelina. Can bolt if you let them go too far, and then you're going to have little brassica weeds all summer long that you're going to be dealing with, and a lot of those have hard seeds, so they'll stay in the soil for several years before they germinate. So I'm just not a fan of multi-species mixes. And the issue with movies like Kiss the Ground or Food Inc. or King Corn or any of these movies which I have watched, I force myself to watch these movies because they educate me on what's the thought think. Right? What am I up against? Yeah. The issue is that these movies boil incredibly complicated topics down into these, if farmers just planted multi-species mixes, by God, our water quality problems would be solved. The solution is simple. I can't believe none of these people have thought of this before. Man, that just boils my blood. It's so much more complicated than that. And to be fair, I'm from California, all right? I'm from Long Beach. I think I have my granola cred. I also served in the military, so there's my conservative cred. Now I happily live in the Midwest in Iowa, but I used to live in all these urban environments. Grew up in Minneapolis, right? Lived in San Francisco, Monterey, California, Los Angeles. I've lived in Iowa City. I've lived in a lot of these urban places. I understand the topics of conversation that urban folks or people who are removed from farming have around subjects like water quality and soil health and erosion, and why they get so into movies like King Corn and Food Inc. and Kiss the Ground. First of all, Woody Harrelson is an attractive, talented actor, so like right off the bat, you're going to want to get into that movie, but it also speaks to them. It helps them understand something that they wouldn't previously have any understanding of because they've grown up completely removed from agriculture. But it's like, look, just because it sounds great and super interesting and it helps you understand some aspects of farming better, broaden your horizons. Maybe watch other shows. Listen to podcasts like The Water Table. I don't know, go to a local SWC meeting. Maybe go to some field days that your local agricultural co-op is hosting. Talk to farmers. I guarantee you during harvest, farmers are bored out of their flippin' brains. Go stop a combine and ask if you can ride along with them for a few hours. Some of them might say no, but I guarantee you'll find a farmer who will say, sure, get on in. Here's the buddy seat. Did you bring food? And you can ask them all kinds of questions. So those movies drive me nuts because they simplify something that should not be simplified. Okay, that's honestly.
I think the funniest thing about what you said there when you talked about where you lived and to try to give yourself some liberal credibility is all of the Iowa farmers listening to this. You know, they're like, okay, until you said Iowa City. Now they know you lived in and you know,
real.
if you're from Iowa. To me, that's hilarious.
Yeah. Well, but I just speak to both sides. So when I go to presentations, I try to see things from both sides of the conservation agriculture like wedding, right? I try to be on both sides of the aisle and get people to see agriculture and conservation from both angles. And it's so easy to get sucked on both sides into, just one track minds, like one lane of thinking, very shuttered, blinkered ways of thinking about the situation. And it's actually really nuanced. And I'll call my people, my more agricultural minded people on their bull poop, and I'll call people that are more environmentalist on their bull crap as well, because both sides spew a lot of crap.
Right.
But yeah, kiss the ground. Woody Harrelson, damn you. If you're listening to this, sir.
I thought of that as we were talking. Wasn't planning on that question. But how about, just a really old practice around no-till? Is there any way to revive that, or any reason to, and have more no-till in some of these practices?
Yeah, I love no-till. It's actually one of my favorite practices. I understand for a variety of reasons why people don't want to transition to it. I love no-till. I wish more people would farm with no-till, but I also wish that our definition of what no-till is didn't need to be so rigid. Like, there's no-till that I think could use a judicious every 3 to 4 year application of something like turbo or vertical till mixed in, right? Because depending on where you are and what soil types you have, you're going to get a banding of fertilizer, you're going to get these acidic zones, because you're applying everything over the top and then you're reliant on herbicides. That's something a lot of lay people in the urban public don't understand, is they're like, why isn't everybody no-till? And I'm like, well, I thought you didn't like Roundup. I thought you didn't like chemicals. And guess what? If people completely transition to no-till, they are reliant on chemicals for control now, because they can't go in there and till up their fields. Right. And I wish that cost share wasn't tied to never putting steel in the field again. Like, there's a judicious application of a vertical tiller or a turbo tiller every few years in order to prevent these long-term issues with no-till from cropping up, like pH bands or high phosphorus bands or what have you, especially the further west you move. In a state like Iowa, where we get tons of rain, the real hit comes not from these pH bands or phosphorus bands or whatever building up, but from the cold temps of the soil and the moisture that ends up being retained. And there's tons of research to support this. When you switch to no-till in Iowa, you are easily going to be dealing with a 3 to 5 year yield hit before you return back to normal yields. You don't go to higher yields. And there's a lot of research that supports this too. Like, transitioning to no-till doesn't 7-10 years from now suddenly give you higher yields. You just return to normal. And that's because there's a lot of biology in the soil that kind of has to reset itself when you switch to no-till. And what kills me is, it's like, if you're a tenant farmer, and let's talk about this for a sec, because Iowa, 60% of Iowa's land is tenanted, meaning it's farmed by somebody who doesn't own it. And that number's only increasing. Of the tenanted acres, roughly 80%, that number differs depending on the study. Some say 88%, some say 80%, but I'm going to fall back on the more conservative number of 80%. Roughly 80% of tenanted acres are in a cash rent year-to-year lease. Okay, so for those listening, a cash rent year-to-year lease means that farmer has no clue if they're going to be farming that farm next year.
Yeah.
All right?
Yeah.
As a tenant farmer, are you going to take a known yield hit for 3 to 5 years, knowing that you might not farm that farm again the next year, and your landlord certainly isn't going to share in the costs of the yield hit that you will take to adopt no-till, and there are no real benefits long-term. You're not going to get more yield after that 3 to 5 years, so there's no benefits to the farmer to adopt that practice, and the landlord isn't going to share in those costs. Why would you do that? There's zero incentive there to adopt that practice. We don't build businesses that way. That's not smart business sense. So I love no-till. I think financially, if we want more of it, I think we need to pony up. The public needs to pony up and throw some more cost share resources at it. This is an unpopular opinion, but I will argue that if we're going to only throw pennies at cover crop, then I'm like, can we just throw that money instead at incentivizing stronger and making stronger incentives for no-till conversion instead?
I mean, it's kind of some of the same reasons. So, batch and build. Let's go back to that, as that's a pretty big process, and something that Water Table, Prinsco, our industry's pretty excited about from a water quality standpoint. And what do you see as, like you said, it's a practice that is number one, and it's booming. But what do you see the future of that in your area, Iowa, and then beyond Iowa, I guess?
Yeah, I'm incredibly excited about saturated buffers and bioreactors. There's tons of research to support their efficacy. Just for your listeners, saturated buffers and bioreactors are basically septic systems for a farm field, just taking advantage of advanced drainage to treat tile water before it gets to a stream or a ditch. It's nothing fancy, actually. They're elegant, simple solutions to tile nitrates. And there's gobs of research from Iowa State University and other universities that support a number of anywhere from 40 to 60% treatment throughout the course of a year. That number would be 100% or close to it, but there are times of high flow that both a bioreactor and a saturated buffer will allow water to go around, because in snow melt or heavy rainstorms, you don't want to flood a farm field, so some of the water can move through those structures. But throughout the course of a year, they can treat an average of 50% of the water moving through them, which is amazing.
Yeah. I
am so excited about them. And farmers, and as I've already explained, farmers and landowners are a fan of them because it doesn't require in-field management changes. And they're inexpensive to put in, and there's robust cost share to support them. Over the last 5 years, probably 300 or 400 of these structures have gone in and are going to be going in, and more of them are going to be going in the next couple of years. To put that into context, prior to 2020, over a 10-year period from 2010 to 2020 or something like that, in Polk County, 6 were put in. So the batch and build model takes it away from takes the onus of doing the project away from the landowner, turns it into a large batch of landowners. A central coordinator manages it and utilizes state funding. That state funding moves through a public agency like a county or a nonprofit, so that the tax burden is also not on the landowner, and landowners are given a small incentive per outlet to participate in the program. Suddenly we're putting 50, 60, 70 of these structures in a single batch. We follow a creek, and we just run up a creek, and we talk to all the people who own properties along that creek or that drainage ditch, and we're away to the races. They are incredibly hard. It's easy for the landowner. We try to create a giant easy button for the landowner. What you need to understand is that behind the scenes, it is not easy. It takes a village to manage a batch and build. My company, my team, is the first retailer-led team to manage a batch and build. We are the only retailer that is currently managing a batch and build in Iowa. I want that to expand to other ag retailers, but I will say that there are many roadblocks and barriers in place from agencies that are not a fan of the batch and build model to kind of prevent that from happening. And it's my goal to tear those barriers down and get it so that the batch and build model can be launched anywhere. It is frustrating, some of the barriers and the roadblocks that have been put into place. And it makes sense why those barriers and roadblocks are in place. They're, IDALS, the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, huge fan of batch and builds, is very supportive. But we have our federal arm of conservation in Iowa, depending on where you are and what county you're in, they are less of a fan of that model. And I think that there's a few things that are happening there, but we need to get through to those agencies. We need to get those folks to see that we're just trying to get conservation on the ground, and it shouldn't matter who's leading the batch and build. Anybody should be able to launch a batch and build. And to be clear, I don't get a penny. So the cost share dollars that go into the batch and build, I don't get a penny of that. My team does not get a penny of that. That goes straight to the landowners or straight to the, fiscal agent, the nonprofit agency or the state agency that's bidding out the project as a public good project. I don't see a penny of that. It's my private partners that are paying for me to do this work. And it's just frustrating because we'll go to a local office and we'll hear a local, like an NRCS office, and we'll hear someone say, this is wrong. Heartland Co-op's an ag retailer. Y'all shouldn't be leading one of these. And I'm just trying to fight that. And I'm going to keep fighting it. Yeah. I went off a little bit there, but.
Well, yeah, we're going to do more podcasts, and that's the next topic. I think
that's my axe to grind.
I know, and I may, if I go down that road for me too, that'll be a challenge. But the whole purpose of the water table and what, gets you out of bed in the morning is the idea that we can help people. Yeah. So why wouldn't you want all kind of be, hey, Heartland's helping people. I'm supportive of that.
If you want to sell conservation, think about it. We're already really good flipping salespeople. I'm really good at selling something. My team, my conservation agronomists, are really good at selling conservation practices. You hire in a local federal office people who do not have sales backgrounds, do not have customer service backgrounds. It's not a slight on those folks, but it's like, golly, don't you think it would make sense to partner with a company that this is what we do for a living? We sell stuff and we're real good at it. We solve problems, and we see a problem and we go, hey, I got a conservation practice that could solve this for you. And it's in our vested interest to make sure that it's going to work for that farmer, because by golly, our livelihoods are built around that farmer being successful. So that farmer's going to trust us. I don't understand why you wouldn't want to leverage that model. 5 to 10 years ago, you would hear public agencies say, conservation's not going to be successful till ag retailers come to the table. We need these people. Until ag retailers really start to support conservation, it's never going to happen. Mm-hmm. Now we're coming to the table and they're like, whoa, slow down. Yeah. Now, we didn't want you really coming into our space and showing us that you can do it better than we can.
Yeah, move their cheese.
Yeah.
And the reality of it is which all the agencies, public and private, agree these conservation practices are a good thing, they work. So why wouldn't we want to have more of them, right?
Yeah, in Iowa, we have some frustratingly influential left-wing environmentalist bloggers that write angry think pieces from their ivory towers. These folks don't actually go out and do any of the work in the trenches like my team or people for IDALs, like the work that we're doing. But they write these angry think pieces that also speak to this urban public. And that's what really breaks my heart is it's not really true. And you read this angry blog or you watch your Woody Harrelson Kiss the Ground crap, and you think that that's the reality, and then you go and vote accordingly, and it's not the reality, and you wind up hindering the progress, the very progress that you want to see happen, you wind up slowing it down. So that's what we're fighting now. That's what my team fights against. That's what I fight against, is this misinformation that just gets spewed out by wackadoodle left-wing, environmentalists. And I want to respect them, but it's like, man, you're not doing any of this work. Now, if you were down here in the trenches with me, this would be a different conversation, because it's like you're fighting the same fight I'm fighting, and we need to sit down and talk through this. But you don't do any of this work. You sit in your fancy office at your university and you type these angry blogs, and you don't do any of the work. And so that's what kind of breaks my heart, is that these people that just slow progress down. But when you've built a brand on divisive rhetoric, as a lot of environmentally focused groups have done, they just build a brand on divisive rhetoric to just slow progress down. You're actually slowing conservation down by grinding these ag-focused groups to a halt on the projects that they want to,
Right.
So that's what's frustrating. Anyway, I'm getting into hyperbole, so I'll come back to the topic at hand.
One of the questions I was going to ask, and I don't necessarily think I need to now, but is, what frustrates you?
Now you know.
So, but what are you really passionate about? I mean, you've said a lot of this already, but if you had to kind of boil it down, there's a lot of things about your job. I know this from talking to you previously and that you really enjoy, but what's the one thing that you feel like you can make a big difference on and that gets you out of bed every morning to go to work?
Yeah, I traveled. I did for the last 2 years. I've traveled around the world on a project for an organization called Nuffield International Farming Scholarships. And so I went to 16 different countries, and then I traveled around the United States, and I was studying conservation farming adoption in these countries and across the U.S. I was looking at like regulatory approaches to conservation farming in other countries, and then for that matter, in other states in the U.S. And a lot of voluntary nutrient reduction approaches, for example, like in the Great Barrier Reef or in the Chesapeake Bay, have been around for a few decades, and they haven't been met with a lot of success. And there's a variety of reasons for that. Mainly, there's just zero infrastructure to support those nutrient reduction strategies. So, you can create a book about something, but if you don't then back it up with infrastructure to support it, it's going to be hard to get it to be successful. But here in Iowa, our nutrient reduction strategy, drafted a little over 10 years ago. Oh, we're not in Iowa. We're in Minnesota. Okay, whatever.
I was going to.
In Iowa, our nutrient reduction strategy is a little over a decade old. We've come very close to meeting our phosphorus goal. And nitrogen has remained stable, but in the last 10 years, we have built cost share programming infrastructure. We have built personnel and teams across the state. It's like we built the scaffolding to paint the house. Now just let us paint the house. What gets me out of bed every morning is this thought that 15 years from now, I want some person in Washington, D.C. to be like, damn, Iowa, they just came out of the rear like a black horse. They're meeting all their voluntary nutrient reduction goals. Like, what the hell happened there? And there's just all these incredibly talented people. My team, my conservation agronomists who work for me, Polk County, Idals, just all these passionate people who are all working together to get the voluntary nutrient reduction strategy in Iowa to be successful. So what gets me out of bed is that. My goal is to prove that it can be done. And I think if there's any state that is primed to be able to make it successful, it is Iowa. The tricky thing is proving out that it can work before those angry hate and discontent makers can tear it down. And so, what do you do if your platform is built on proving that the voluntary model won't work? You throw roadblocks in place. When the voluntary model starts to look like it's going to work, you throw roadblocks in place to slow it down. So my goal is to stay one step ahead of the naysayers who say it can't be done, and, like water around a rock, right? Try to prove that the voluntary model can work.
Right. Do you feel like, this is not a question I was thinking of either, but it just came up. Do you see that those people, those naysayers, are ramping it up more right now? And if you do, then that's probably because they see it's working.
You got it. Absolutely. There's a investigative reporter for, I think, American Public Media, who is just rattling the cages of all of my public partners. They haven't come to Heartland yet, but they've come to a lot of my public partners in Iowa. Making freedom of information requests and trying to dive into the nuts and bolts of the batch and build, I think, in an effort to prove that the batch and build is inefficient and it's a bad use of taxpayer dollars. And oh man, it just boils my blood because there's so much research that shows how effective it is to do the batch and build versus leaving the onus on the landowner or the grower to do it themselves. And it's way less expensive to do it that way. And also just the efficacy of the structures themselves. That investigation is happening, probably at the behest of like some of these environmentalist groups and environmentalist bloggers who just don't want to see the batch and build model be successful, because by golly, if it's successful, that means voluntary adoption could be a reality. And when you've built a brand around regulation being the only option, that is not good. So yeah, absolutely, it's ramping up. It's only getting worse, but I'm telling you, hopefully logic prevails. Hopefully logic prevails.
Well, I'm about ready to switch gears, but I want to kind of leave that part of the discussion with, thank you for being such an advocate for water quality, for agriculture, for production. I think for the American spirit. Thank you for that. It's way better, and you feel a lot better when you go to bed at night knowing that you're providing solutions rather than prolonging a problem.
You got it.
Thank you for that from I think, well, for sure from the water table, but from, I think, the agricultural industry. Appreciate that. Before I move on, though, you did say these 16 countries you've been to, were all of them like developed countries, or were you in?
It was a mix.
Okay.
Yep, it was a mix. I was in Europe, I was in Southeast Asia, I was in South America, Central America, and Australia. The only continent that I didn't go to was the continent of Africa.
Did you see anything in there that that surprised you from the standpoint of you did not think you would see conservation
absolutely.
at the levels?
Yeah,
actually, speak to that, or?
Absolutely. It's a chapter in my manuscript that I wrote. Okay. But it's soil degradation, especially soil erosion, is way worse than I thought around the world. And I left Iowa naively thinking that these other countries I was going to go to who had higher rates of adoption of things like no-till, or they call it zero-till in some places, or higher rates of adoption of like cover crops or other, like in Brazil, they have the forest code. I just thought I would go to these places and they would just be so much better than Iowa, right? Like, I admit, I love Iowa. I'm an agronomist in Iowa trying to make things better there, but I just thought, yeah, we still have a ways to go, right? Then I go to these other countries and it was like, oh my gosh, we are nowhere near as bad as we're told we are. Like, holy cow. Iowa's average erosion rate is about 5 tons of topsoil per acre per year. That ain't sustainable. I'll argue with anybody about that. But Brazil is, 20 to 50 tons of topsoil per acre per year, and they don't have as much as us to lose. So that was really concerning to see that. When I was in Europe, the amount of the regulatory approach in Europe is very strong compared to, so I was in Denmark, the Netherlands, one other country that's escaping me right now. And the regulatory approach in those places is extreme and incredibly expensive. I don't think taxpayers understand how expensive it is. And so that really blew me away. And also, it just so happens I went to a bunch of places that have crappier soil than Iowa. I naively assumed, like, everybody's got soils like we do. I go to other countries where it's like, of course they adopted no-till. They got an immediate yield increase by adopting no-till because they were conserving moisture. Suddenly they could grow a crop where before they couldn't grow a crop. Canada, they would summer fallow their fields every other year just to collect moisture. Now, if they're no-till, by golly, they can get a yield every year. Right. You go to Brazil, well, of course they're going to adopt no-till and cover crops. Now they can grow a second crop in the dry season. Right. Now they're getting 2 harvests a year instead of 1. Why wouldn't you adopt those conservation practices? And I interviewed over 100 farmers as I traveled around the world. And I asked these guys, like, why did you adopt these practices? And their first response is, well, yeah, it was a no-brainer. I immediately got a yield increase. It's not that these people care more about the environment than Iowa farmers, right? I mean, not that they don't care about the environment, but it's a financial no-brainer for them to do it. Right. Whereas in Iowa, it's not a financial no-brainer. Right. So.
Yeah, it's we'll talk about that later, but I've had an opportunity to be in the Netherlands in the last year twice, and just fascinating on an agricultural standpoint.
And what's going on over there about closing down farms? It's just crazy.
Right.
Yeah, it's nuts.
Right. So maybe we'll talk about that in the future. But just kind of moving on, I kind of want to know a little bit about you personally, and I think it does connect to your passion and your job and things like that. And so you were talking earlier before off air about this commercial garden, and talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I do a ton of vegetable gardening. My husband and I have a 5-acre small farm. You could call it a property, if you will, outside central Iowa, outside Marshalltown. And we're both avid hunters, so we try to harvest our own meat throughout the year. Yeah. We have chickens. We have a very large vegetable garden. We do all of our own canning, freezing, dehydrating. We do a lot of that stuff that you see on those nice TikTok videos. And we love it. It's a labor of love. It's a lot of fun. I'm young, so I'm going to keep doing it until I can't do it anymore physically. But I used to run an actual farm to market vegetable garden. Now I don't. But I used to do that work, and it was backbreaking and financially, very difficult. The statistic is for most vegetable farms that try to make it as a farm to market farm, within 5 years, 80-something% of them are going to fold. And I understand why now. Yeah. No shame. I learned a lot. Yeah. Yeah. Do you consider it fair that a
saturated buffer is a pretty good place to hunt pheasants, and you know where they all are.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, everyone's like, wow, Ruth, you're so passionate about this. I'm like, yeah, it's purely from the goodness of my heart. When in reality, it's like, hey, you're going to be putting in 2.5 miles of this native buffer strip. Do you mind if I come out here in November and just rustle up some pheasants? They're technically a non-native species. So in reality, I am just protecting America from a non-native bird.
Yeah, invasive species.
Yeah,
right?
well, I mean, they're not technically. I know we have to split hairs here.
Yes.
Invasive means that it's damaging, and non-native. Non-native just means it's non-native, but it's not damaging.
Yeah.
So something like purple loosestrife, that's an invasive species because it damages wetland environments, no matter how pretty it is. Pheasants are, they're non-native, but they didn't displace any other species by themselves.
It's a great sport and a great pastime.
Oh man, heck yeah! Nothing feels
it.
better than having something fly up behind you, scaring the crap out of you. You whip around and you just drill it to the ground, and then you go home and you make pheasant tenders. There's probably some animal activist that's going to be listening to this and get real upset, but
that's just fine with me.
Yeah, I'm okay with it.
But Ruth, thank you for joining the water table today, and let's stay in touch and keep seeing what's going on in conservation in Iowa.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. This was a ton of fun.